have to pay for it even if you don't want it. And it's, again, a kind of neat libertarian exercise to think, okay, just at bottom, what is the difference between the government and the mafia? Each of whom, they would tell you, are giving you important services, protection included. Your reaction to all of this might, though, be, look, okay, but come off it. Don't we need the state? Don't we have to have the state to provide a whole bunch of things for us? And indeed, there's a whole range of objections which have been offered to libertarianism along those grounds. What are some examples? Well, what I'm going to do is just to refer to them and then offer the kind of response, an indication of the kind of response that libertarians have given. What, first of all, about law? It's the most obvious one. Libertarians would say, yes, indeed, we need law, but they'd say historically we haven't always needed the state to provide it. And some of them are kind of specialists in the history of early Ireland and early Iceland, for example, where they'd say law was originally consensual and custom-based. It wasn't a product of the state. Why then, their critics would say, why on earth would people agree to it? And essentially they said, look, it worked like this. Protection from other people, you're being protected from other people predating on you, depended on your going along with the law. If you flout the law, if you disregard it, if it imposes a penalty on you and you don't pay it, what happens? Well, you're declared an outlaw. This has got kind of vague echoes of cowboy movies or Robin Hood and so on, but it's actually a pretty serious matter, because if you're an outlaw, then basically anyone else can do anything to you or your property that they want with impunity. You haven't the protection of the law. And so there's the idea here that there is a huge incentive to go along with what the law is doing, because if you break it, you're really making yourself vulnerable. A later example was the so-called law merchant, which was developed in courts, which were meeting, offering dispute resolution to merchants who moved from one fair in one country to another fair in another, displaying their goods and so on. Perhaps someone sold something to someone else which wasn't any good. Perhaps they didn't deliver when they promised. That they might take these people to the court, and the court would make a judgment against them. Again, what is the sanction? Well, basically, if they didn't go along with what these courts said, the word would get around and other merchants wouldn't deal with them in the future. More generally, within these sorts of ideas, if people do bad things to others, they have to give them compensation. I mean, typically, that was the penalty that was given. And this, indeed, a form of so-called tort law, operated really as a kind of non-governmental alternative to criminal law. You can see the sort of stuff that people are now charged under criminal law as also involving doing harm to someone else and one being able to get civil judgment for that. Consider the O.J. Simpson case, where there are the two levels of judgment going on. I could go on with all of this, but I guess you get roughly the picture. You might, though, say, OK, you know, this stuff about early Ireland and early Iceland and so on, it's kind of quaint. But isn't it just archaic? Does it have any relevance now? Well, it isn't necessarily something that's only relevant in the past. Why? Well, companies are today increasingly, as I understand it, shifting to private dispute resolution rather than going through the courts. And so there is a kind of private legal sector operating independently of the courts. A friend of mine has done work looking at the treatment of bankruptcies in Silicon Valley, where indeed it turns out that a few firms of lawyers handle these things and offer a kind of form of dispute resolution and a tidying up of assets and so on, rather than they're taking the whole thing through the regular courts. Okay, this is the sort of response that would be given in terms of law. You might say, all right, let's at least stop talking about that for now. I may not be convinced, but let's move on to something else. What about codes of conduct? For example, the rule of the road, or that you mustn't cry fire in a crowded theatre, or the regulation of things that are dangerous, and so on. Surely we need government to look after this. A libertarian would say, no, no. We can handle this. We can indicate how you can handle this by means of private property ownership. You might think, private property ownership? I mean, how does that work? Well, the idea is this. If roads were privately owned, then the companies owning them could decide on the rules. For example, speed limits, emission controls, and so on. Similarly, as to conduct in theatres, they could regulate what people are and aren't allowed to do. Why should they want to do that? Well, if they don't, they'd face action in the courts. And indeed, some libertarians have stressed the role of judges and jury-made tort law in providing an alternative to safety regulations. You may possibly have come across, a little while back, that there was a big court judgment against McDonald's for serving very, very hot coffee. I mean, this came about basically because someone bought it, was sitting in a car, put the cup of coffee between their legs, moved off, it spilled over them, and an elderly lady got very badly burned from the very, very hot coffee. And what happened was that a court case was taken out for damages against McDonald's. It was argued that, various people had been hurt, that various people had complained that it was too hot, and a massive judgment was made against McDonald's. They had to pay heavy damages to this woman. And what then was the result? Well, after that, they shifted the temperature at which they were serving their coffee. And you find now that there are also typically warnings all over everything which is served hot, warning people that this is hot, in part to try to avoid such judgments. So, this is another kind of path to doing things without government. What, though, you might say about defense? Surely this is the one where you really need the government. Libertarians, I think, would typically say, well, if you're talking about defense, the issue depends many ways in what the problem really is. First of all, if you're thinking about things domestically, just people's domestic safety and matters of that kind, people, or more likely communities, can hire security people to look after these matters, and indeed, in many cases, actually do that now. But what you might say about foreign aggression, surely this is the key. The libertarians would say, look, if you're talking about defense against other states, there is indeed a problem. But the libertarian would say, look, what we would do is address this in the long term, as it were, by encouraging the spread of libertarian ideas. Because if you're worried about other states, they will only be a problem insofar as other people are supporting those states and going along with them. If we spread our ideas, then those states will be weakened and they won't be a threat. Some libertarians in the face of this would say, okay, but in the short term you're going to need a state for defensive purposes until other changes take place. Others will often say, look, if ordinary people can arm themselves, first of all, we're not then likely to be invaded. And they often point to the Swiss, who are, a pretty peaceable country, but where everyone undergoes training. Typically, most adult males will hold firearms and so on, and people don't set out and invade Switzerland. And they say on the one side, if your population is heavily armed, you're not likely to be invaded, but also you don't look like a threat to others. And that one of the traditional problems about defense has been that your defense looks to other people as if you're going to attack them, but no one, I think, is going to expect that ordinary armed citizens are going to set out and attack other countries. What also then about public goods and welfare and so on? Well, libertarians here typically look to various forms of private provision. For example, by way of tie-ins, so that one product is supplied along with others. Groups may get together and provide things for themselves. One may have recourse to property ownership again, and also various insurance schemes. I could go on about this, but all told, I think libertarians, at least the wise ones, don't claim that they've got an immediate answer for every question, but rather they've got indications as to how these things might be tackled. They will, though, typically say it's only conditions of freedom that will allow people to come up with answers to these sorts of problems. I mean, you can't say what is the answer instantly, but they might say equally well, how many of us could have predicted the kinds of solution to other problems that private companies are coming up with every day? Further, they'd say don't underrate the problems about doing things by means of the state. Each time they say there is war, the scope of the state grows. It tends to take on more powers, and it is then very reluctant to hand back those powers that it's taken on. Indeed, lots of people are only too glad when there's a state there to try to give them other people's money. They'll appeal to the state to use its powers to their advantage, or to try to get the state to grant them various kinds of privileges. And so libertarians say, look, it's really dangerous to have the state around. It's a problem. Where, after all this, one might ask, where did libertarianism come from? Well, clearly, it stems in many ways from classical liberalism, but its modern form it developed in the US. Here it drew upon a heritage of rights theory. There's a sense in which, if you go back to the founding period, emphasis there on rights, in a way taken very much more seriously, can lead one in the direction of libertarianism. It also drew on free market economics and also on the romantic individualist ideas of Ayn Rand's novels. Ayn Rand is really a massive seller. I mean, she comes typically, in terms of sales of books and her influence, only just a bit under the Bible in terms of the number of people whose lives she's touched, and a good number of people who've been struck by her work and by the sort of strong individualism within it, then find libertarianism quite